Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the early and mid-stage carers meeting, latest in a series of meetings offered by Rare Dementia Support for those of you caring for and about someone living with a rare form of dementia. My name is Seb Crutch. I'm one of the psychologists at the Dementia Research Centre and at RDS, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this online session today. I hope wherever you are, you've been able to make some space in your day to join us. Very conscious that people will be coming to this meeting in different situations and circumstances. For some of you, it will be easy to get a quiet space and a little bit, I hope, a little bit of a mental break from whatever the rest of your normal life involves. For other people, I realize you'll be juggling lots of different tasks. So however you're joining us today, we're really pleased you're here. We hope you're also not being too buffeted by Storm Eustace in the background and that I'm in quite an exposed shed. So if there is any clattering or banging during the meeting, then that's probably me to blame as branches are falling off the trees above me. But anyway, those disasters aside, let me tell you a little bit about what we've got planned for you today. So as usual, the meeting will be recorded, just to let you know, so that those of us people who can't join live now are able to listen in later on. And the main theme of today's meeting is around planning. And so we're looking forward to having Nikki Zimmermann talk to us about identifying and mapping your support needs. And we're also going to be welcoming a little bit later Trish O'Hara and Michael Marshall talking about entitlements and mapping some of the resources that you will need or that might be helpful to be aware of. And then we'll be talking a little bit about some more everyday scenarios, starting a new series of talks initially today with Claire Waddington talking to us about how to keep enjoying meal times and some of the varied and different challenges, but also positive possibilities there are for adapting what's an essential part of everyday lives and a great way of sustaining relationships, even against and in spite of different difficulties that you and your loved ones might be facing. And then we'll have our usual question and answer panel session at the end, where I would be very pleased to receive as many questions as you would care to put in the question and answer box. And I will do my best to give voice to those questions and put those to our panel, which will include all of our speakers, and also Dr. Dexter Penn, who's joining us to answer clinical and medical reflections on anything that you'd like to raise. As always, we are very pleased to have your comments and responses. We don't actually have the chat box today, so in the question and answer box, that's the place to put not just your questions for the Q&A session later, but also any reflections, any experiences that you would like to share, any reactions you have to things that are being said by any of the speakers or being described. And I will try and in between speakers, try and reflect those back to people so that other people can hear what you've commented. I won't be able to read out all of them, I'm afraid, but anything that's you think is relevant and helpful for other people is particularly welcomed. Okay, so without further ado, I shall hand over to Nikki Zimmermann to start us off with our first talk today. But as I say, please do be putting question and answers all the way through, and I will try and relay those on to Nikki if they're pertinent to her talk. Okay, I will see you in a few minutes.
Thank you, Seb. And as always, it's wonderful to be here. I'm just about to get my slides up. Here we go. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. So yeah, I'm Nikki Zimmermann. I'm the direct support team lead. Got a fantastic team here at RDS, which many of you will have spoken to. And for anybody new joining today that hasn't spoke to us, please do get in touch, at any time you need to via our email, and we can arrange to have a call with you. I'm going to talk about identifying and mapping support needs today and how to go about that. So many of you today will be caring for someone who's newly diagnosed, or you may not be. You may be caring for someone who's had their diagnosis for a while, but you've never reached out to get any support before, or you don't think that you have any support. So some of the questions that we're going to be looking at are, do I need support, and what help can I get? Where do I get it from? Now, we're asking you these questions if you feel you need support, but I think it's a really important time to start asking yourself those questions, even at point of diagnosis, of do I actually need support? Because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and there's lots of support available out there, and it comes in all shapes and sizes, but actually sort of identifying what your needs are and what your loved ones' needs are is really important. So when we look at identifying needs, we look at actually our roles as carers, caregivers, loved ones. There's various different terminology. Some people don't like the word carer. They don't see themselves as a carer. And that's absolutely fine. It's each to their own of what they want that sort of label to be. But it's realizing, that actually we're all very lovely human beings, and we do actually do an awful lot for our loved ones without realizing it. So there's lots of tasks that we do that we would do voluntary, and we don't sort of think that it's actually support or care. And I want today to go through a few of those things to help us identify how much we actually do for our loved ones. Now, we're going to use a format today of an actual needs assessment, which is through the local social services. Now, getting a needs assessment doesn't necessarily mean you'll get help. It will mean your needs are identified. So the needs for your loved ones are identified in the different categories. But that, I really must stress, doesn't mean that they are automatically going to provide you with that help. So the needs assessment process, as I said, is through the local authority. So it's through your local social services, and they'll have dedicated social care teams to do this. Sometimes the needs assessment, the first part of it is online, and you can do this on the local authority website, or sometimes they'll do it with you through the phone, or sometimes they'll come to you and visit your house to do this. Now, when you answer the questions on this, and this is a needs assessment, not for you as a carer, but for your loved ones that have a diagnosis for rare dementia, we need these questions answered completely unaided. So it's you can answer them with your partner, with your loved one, but actually thinking in your head, can my loved one do this completely unaided? So these are a couple of things that I've sort of got from the website, and it's looking at whether your person that you're looking after, their needs are affected, which actually inhibits them to have the ability to do the task, and where they look at two or more of the following outcomes from the list that we're going to go through to see what level of assistance the person needs. But what they're also going to look at is how their well-being is actually affected by if it's affected by not being able to do these tasks on their own. So these are the categories. There's lots of words on these slides, and I've done this for a reason, because I'm going to make sure the slides get out to all of you that are watching today next week when we send our follow-up. So you'll actually be able to have these to look through yourself. And all the categories I've marked in red, so it's very easy for you to see. Now, when they do needs assessments, generically, they would look at somebody which is quite frail and that has needs that probably won't come into the same categories or the same way we look at it with rare dementias. Because as you all know, with a rare dementia, it's not the same as having Alzheimer's disease, for example, at an older age when there's lots of other comorbidities involved. There's other things that will be as important and have such an impact as well, but it won't fit into their categories. So it's looking at these different categories with the issues and impacts that your loved ones have. So the first one that they would look at is managing and maintaining nutrition. So food and diet, basically. And they'll be looking at, whether the person that you look after, so can XXX I've put, so perhaps we'll call her Eunice today because of the storm that's brewing. So can Eunice plan her meals independently? Can she shop independently, prepare meals? and cook without any help from you. Now, according to the impact, whether if somebody has a memory deficit through having young onset Alzheimer's disease, for example, they may be, they may have forgotten how to shop and plan meals themselves. They may need a lot of assistance with that. And they may need assistance with preparing the meals because they've forgotten what to do in what sequence things go. But then we've got people here that will be caring for somebody that has FTD, and they might have difficulty shopping. They might really enjoy food. And, we do know that a sweet tooth and food obsession is really a common symptom with people with FTD. So there'll be problems there with buying food, eating food off the shop, buying lots of chocolate, preparing food, eating food straight away. Again, somebody with PPA may have problems communicating this, so they may struggle going to the shop to be able to buy their food. And again, if we look at somebody with PCA, they may have problems with their visual perception, so shopping would be very difficult for them. They might pick up the wrong things in the shop. They may struggle preparing food because of the safety, chopping food up with a sharp knife. So it's looking at the whole aspect of diet and managing your nutrition, of what the impact is actually for your loved one. So then we'll go on to maintaining personal hygiene. So this is, washing, cleaning, showering, those sorts of things. And they'll look at, does Eunice shower, brush her teeth, wash and style her hair, or without any assistance or prompting or any suggestions? So this isn't just, does somebody need personal care, but it's what help do they need, even from the very beginning of prompting that way. We do know that some people are very reluctant to have showers. They may fear the shower. They may have visual perception where they struggle in the shower. They may have memory issues that they don't remember that they've already showered, or they thought they've just already showered. So it's looking at the personal hygiene and what help that your loved one actually needs within those boundaries there, the different sort of parts of it, whether it's prompting and suggesting to full on, we need, to help in the shower now. And then we'll go on to managing toilet needs. And this is always a big one when people do have problems going to the toilet. They may start having incontinence. They may have trouble seeing the toilet. So they may need some help having a different colour toilet seat. They may have an obsession of going to the toilet. And we're looking at just not in the house as well now, and people sometimes have trouble identifying the room in the house, but also outside the house. And when you're in this shopping centres, for example, we have great problems these days, whereas we have these fancy public toilets where you go in one way and out the other. And obviously, that can be really disorientated for people. And I know lots of people have got lost with that. So looking at all the different aspects of toileting and what problems you think your loved one could have in this category. Then we're going to go on to look on about dressing and being appropriately clothed. And that looks at everything from doing the laundry, knowing when clothes need to be washed, help with using the washing machine, choosing the clothes that they wish to wear, making suitable choices, being able to do buttons and zips, or being fixated with any sort of clothes. And we know that people have reported to us that people living with frontotemporal dementia may have some obsession of wearing, a favourite jumper or having to wear a blue shirt all the time. So, it's looking at those choices. We know that people struggle knowing when to wash their clothes or even the ability to use the washing machine. And we also know that people with PCA really do struggle with putting clothes on the right way, putting jackets on inside out, struggling with zips and buttons, putting on underwear, those sorts of things. So it's looking at what the situation is with your loved one and what problems you can identify with that. And then going on from that, it's looking at the safety in the home. And this is when an OT is really helpful, but it's actually really important looking yourself before you think about having sort of an OT in the house of things that, we look at is safety. So making a cup of tea safely, not burning themselves, not struggling with boiling water, using the cooker and being able to turn it off as well. Looking at running water, using irons, being in charge of locking the doors. So those sorts of things were safety. Going through the kitchen and looking at, how safe the food in the fridges, looking at all the different things, mainly in the kitchen, but sort of with the safety aspects of the house and electrical equipment, and whether people can see, whether they can use things appropriately and safely, or whether, they have problems understanding the health and safety issues and risks that are there. And staying with the home, it's looking at whether your loved one can independently keep the home habitable without any help with you. So would they do the hoovering and the dusting in the house? Would they be able to fix minor issues? Would they be able to change bed sheets and towels and check again food? So it's looking at whether the deficits and the impact of the diseases having them is actually stopping them being able to do these tasks within the house. And then they'll move on to look at the relationships with the house, within the household and within the family, and personal relationships, and what's changed within the diagnosis to within those relationships. And this can be sort of your relationship as a partner, as a spouse, or as a mother, father, or as a parent, or and a child as well. So looking at sort of the relationships and the impact, and what things that you have to do now as a carer, in whichever way you look at it, which will fulfill those roles that your loved one used to do. And then they'll look at things about sort of outside the house more. And they'll look, first of all, at sort of your working status, whether people have retired or not, if they have retired and they've taken part in any volunteering, or if they wanted to do that. And what would the issues be having a rare dementia, which would have an impact on that. And that, again, we would look at personality and behaviours, we'd look at communications, we'd look at visual signs as well, and anything that would impact people on not being able to work or to volunteer. And then they would look at the services in your local community. So things like catching a bus, using public transport, and recreational services. So things like going to the gym, going to the church, going to do activities that they like. And would they be able to do this alone? Would it be safe for them to do it alone? Would there be any risks? So all those sorts of things, which are really integral to people's lives and to their well-being, is really important to look at. And then looking at the caring responsibilities. So things like whether you actually still have young children yourself and their ability to take on and continue with the full role of responsibilities that they used to do, or whether it's, people may have young grandchildren which are often left at them, and would they be safe and able, would there be any risks involved for any prolonged period of time? So looking at how people actually manage their responsibilities. So those are the categories that I've just really sort of whizzed through of what they would look when they're going through the needs assessment. And they would identify what needs people would have, and very specifically to the rare dementia that they actually have. Now, identifying the needs and meeting the needs are different matters, and they would need to do a financial assessment to see whether they would provide financial support to meet those needs. Now, Trish and Michael are going to speak a little bit more about this in the next part of the session. But the support options which often will be offered to people to meet those needs are companion services or personal assistant, and that could be help with attending services, attending activities, going to the gym, buddying up, just going for a walk, going for a coffee, getting out into town, or helping within the house, helping with shopping, helping with bills and admin, various different sorts of things. There might be a shopping service or a food delivery, and Claire's going to talk more about this in her session a bit later, of what support can be put into place to help people stay independent with this. And there's lots of versions of assisted technology which can be really helpful for this. It might be identified within the needs assessment that somebody could do with a bit more help with their personal care. And sometimes this isn't always best met with families. Sometimes there needs to be a bit of separation here and a bit more, if somebody's coming in to help with that, they can be a bit more less resistant to gain that. It might be they might be more resistant and they do need family to do that. So it is very different to different people's circumstances. And also there will be looking whether respite is needed, if there's any risks of carer burnout sort of, because of high needs here. And there's lots of different options when they're looking at respite. It might be getting people in the house to help. It might be activity in day centres, a whole list of things which we can help with. Now, obviously, we've got the Q&A session later, and we really would be delighted for you to put some questions in. But if your issues are really do need some support on a one-to-one level, please do contact us at the contact@Rare Dementia Support email, and we can definitely organise a one-to-one call to help support you there. But we do look forward to receiving lots of questions regarding sort of the talks that we do today. I'm going to hand back over to Seb now, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. And I liked the fact that you started with a little bit of Donald Rumsfeld, sort of known unknowns, things we're aware we don't know, but also some unknown unknowns, all those things which are just never occurred to us. There's no reason we would have thought about these needs before. And also, I guess, as you mentioned, and as we're always very conscious, each person will come to this in a different place. So even the word carer, even deciding whether that is something you can identify with already, or whether that's a word you find quite uncomfortable or a role can't imagine yourself within, I think that can also dictate the extent to which people, at least initially, are keen to pursue this sort of information and understanding about what support they might need, and what support might be available to them. So it really, really helpful. Thank you for you breaking it down in so many categories so clearly. And also, I think, really helpful, particularly with a group such as this. So we have around 100 people on the call today. All of you will be living with or supporting, loving and caring about someone with at least could be one of 7 or 8 different dementias. And even if this was one of our meetings where everyone had an experience of the same dementia, that doesn't mean it would affect everyone in the same way. So that personal approach, that thinking through how does the dementia affect me or my loved one in each of these different categories is really helpful. That critical personal view and deciding what's valuable or helpful to you. I think the only other thing I was reflecting on as you were talking, Nikki, was just about how comfortable people would feel accepting or acknowledging that things are difficult in some of these areas, particularly some of the areas like, for example, preparing food, which people might view as quite basic. And it might feel that there's a degree of shame or embarrassment in saying, actually, even these kind of quite essential activities are affected. And again, I think that's where it's so helpful that you described the different elements within all of those different skills or everyday activities. The fact that it might be that you can do 99% of it still very well and very capably, but your particular type of dementia might affect one critical component of that, and encouraging people to not be embarrassed by that, to view those difficulties as perhaps even a disability. So not a personal failing, but a way in which, given your current change in skills or the challenges you might be facing, it might be just something about the setup. So for example, if you are someone living with PCA, so with prominent visual problems, shops are just really badly designed if you don't have the ability to perceive clearly what and where things are. So that's not a personal failing. It's just about it's the system that we live in. It's the shape of the society that we live in. So just a real encouragement. If there are elements, if you were listening to Nikki and thinking, I'm not sure I could feel comfortable saying that my partner isn't able to do this, or my friend or my family member isn't able to do this in the way that they once were, just please be reassured that there'll be lots of people on on this call who are having a similar struggle to acknowledge some of the difficulties that they're having, but that breaking these tasks down in the way that Nikki's described is really quite helpful. And this is always not about a clear distinction here between, say, being aware of what support is available doesn't mean that you need to take it straight away, but just beginning to contemplate the kinds of support that might be helpful at some point down the line just helps you to be that much more prepared and not taken by surprise by some of these unknown unknowns. So thank you, Nikki. I'm sorry to blather on, particularly if you can't hear me clearly, but I'm sure what you've said there will encourage lots of further questions. Please do feel free to continue popping those in the question and answer box. But for the moment, I think it's time to hand on to Trish and Michael, who are going to be particularly talking about entitlements, things that are available to you, your rights, perhaps services, financial support, etc., that you are very much entitled to, and about finding out and mapping a little bit about where those types of support may come from. So Trish and Michael, over to you.
Everybody. Hello, Trish.
Hey, Michael. Hello, everyone.
I've moved into my son's bedroom to find a quiet spot, so hence the background from me.
It's lovely. It's lovely. So I'm bathed in sunlight. Very lucky. Okay, so Michael, we're going to talk about things that might be bothering people, and I'm just going to talk to you in a conversational way, and I think we're going to talk in a way that hopefully gives people information. But I want to ask, and in a bit of a role play way, I'm going to say, well, like my husband, he told work that he had FTD. He got diagnosed. He told them he had FTD. And when he told them, they pretty much ignored it. And then he was kind of struggling at work. And he said, look, I'm going to have to talk to you about maybe having less hours because this is really becoming difficult. They just didn't want to engage with him at all. They didn't want to talk to him at all. And actually, they just told him he had to leave. And he's had to leave. What's going to happen?
So there's sort of two duties or protections, or two sort of main bodies of law that protect people at work in that sort of situation. So the first comes from the Employment Rights Act 1996, and these protections are generally for people who are employees. So rather than people who have what's called worker status or who are self-employed. And if you're an employee, you've got a right to request flexible working hours. It doesn't matter if you've got FTD or any other health condition, you have this right to ask for it. So the employer's refusal to even engage with that is possibly unlawful. On top of that, if your husband feels like he's been forced to leave work because of the employer's refusal to engage with him, that might be as a result of what's called a breakdown in mutual trust and confidence, which is an important implied term of any employment contract. And if that breaks down and someone feels like they've been forced to leave, then that could potentially be constructive dismissal, which can be potentially unfair. So it may be that your husband has got a claim for unfair dismissal. The other body of law that your husband may have protection from is under the Equality Act 2010, and this places a duty on employers not to discriminate against their employees, but also against workers and self-employed people. So the Equality Act covers a lot, far more people, and gives a far wider protection. There are potentially, I think, 4 kinds of discrimination at play here. So the first is that your husband's been treated less favourably than maybe a co-worker who doesn't have FTD, and that would constitute what's called direct discrimination. If the employer's position is because they've got a rule in place or a policy or something that's applied to everybody, but it just so happens to have affected your husband, then that might constitute what's called indirect discrimination. There's also something called discrimination arising from a disability, where it could be anything that's any less favourable treatment that your husband has experienced as a result of his FTD. And finally, there's a duty on the employer to institute what are called reasonable adjustments. So if your husband has asked for fewer working hours or maybe a change to his working pattern because of his FTD, there's a duty on the employer to at least consider that and to see whether those adjustments would be reasonable. Even at a stage where your husband's FTD isn't that progressed, because it's a long-term condition and is likely to have substantial effects on his ability to carry out his duties at work, it should still be considered as a disability. The main thing to think about if you are facing difficulties at work, your husband is to act quickly. If you want to bring a claim against the employer, there's a 3-month time limit to bring a claim to the employment tribunal. So it's really important to seek out specialist employment advice as soon as possible.
Oh, that's really helpful, actually. And you know what? Just to go on with this, what happens if he's not in work and I feel like I'm going to have to give up work to look after him? How are we going to manage? What can we do financially?
Well, where you're unable to work and you're caring, or you're unable to work because of a health condition, really you then have to turn to what's left of our country's social security system. So there are a variety of different benefits that you might be entitled to. So because your husband's been working, it's likely that he's been paying national insurance contributions over the last couple of years, which means he can claim a benefit called New Style Employment Support Allowance. This is a benefit paid to people who are unfit for work. The process for doing this is you make an application. There's then a health assessment called a work capability assessment, which looks at his ability to carry out many activities or activities that you're likely to find in the workplace. And if you pass that assessment period, then if you pass the work capability assessment, then the benefit goes into payment. There's no means assessment to this. It's just about your national insurance contributions. If you have capital, if you've got savings or shares of less than £16,000, then instead you might be able to claim universal credit, which is a means tested benefit. UC can also help with your housing costs if you rent, and it can give you additional elements if you're a carer or if you're unable to work because of a health condition. There's also non-means tested benefits that help people because they have a disability. So the one for working age people is called personal independence payment. And again, there's an application process, a health assessment, and then based on that, the Department for Work and Pensions will decide whether or not you're entitled to the benefit. The categories that you're assessed on are quite similar to the ones that Nikki was talking about with adult social care. If your husband gets an award of PIP, and specifically of what's called the daily living component of PIP, then you, as his carer, might be entitled to carer's allowance. That depends on the number of hours you're working. The number of hours of care that you're providing. You need to be caring for him for more than 35 hours a week and be earning less than £120 per week. If you meet all those conditions, then you can get carer's allowance, which is unfortunately it's a very low amount of money. It's only about £63 a week.
Would it be any better if I've got children? Is there anything? Can I expect anything more if I've got children?
Not really, to be honest. So if you claim universal credit, there is an additional element for children. So that's people up to the age of 16. You can also get this additional child element if your child is doing what's called full-time non-advanced education. So that might be doing their A-levels or a BTEC or being at a further education college. If they're at university, unfortunately, there's no additional fund for that. It's limited to 2 people. So there was a change made in about 2017 that limited the child element to just 2 children.
Thanks so much for that, Michael, because I think that would really help people for things they're worried about. I really do. So there might be things you wanted to ask me in our conversational role play.
Yes. So who can I turn to for help when I can't look after my wife on my own any longer?
Yeah, sometimes there comes a point when you feel that you're no longer coping, and it could be that you've changed as much as your perhaps partner, whomever you care for, has changed, as they perhaps need more support, then you step up to the plate. But there does come a point usually when you're caring for someone at home where you might need some help. And I mean, essentially, sometimes we ask for help from family and friends, maybe to sit with them while we go out and have a bit of a break. But I'm not sure that can last. I'm not sure that we can be cross if a person doing a favour doesn't turn up. We can't necessarily be directive in how we want them to care for the person, because sometimes they're their sister or their brother and they'll do it their own way, and that might interrupt some of the ways that you want it done. So sometimes we need to bring in essentially strangers to start with, and finding care is not easy. Finding care is something that can be done, as Nikki talked about, because you've had a needs assessment at the local authority, and that needs assessment can be the beginning in some ways of thinking about how to get a care package in your house, and that can be sent to, for instance, or shared with a care agency, and the care agency can use that as a basis to plan with you what sort of care you need at home. But beware, really, a lot of care agencies, they kind of have care that they offer, and you need to purchase or buy whatever it is they're providing. So it's a bit like a shopping list of what they offer, and sometimes it will be a couple of visits a day or a couple of visits a week, and it will be a bit more like buying what they offer rather than you controlling what you want. Some care agencies are more flexible than others. Then there, of course, are ways that you can directly get a carer, and sometimes you can go as simple as putting an advert in your local newspaper or speaking to people that you meet at the carer centre if you've registered there in your local authority area, and just getting to know other carers or other people in your local area, speaking maybe to the Alzheimer's Society, finding out what's going on locally, and then getting to know carers or about carers. Sometimes they'll come to you for an interview, could be quite informal, and you can start off quite small, really. And I would suggest that's a good way to start. When you're not coping, you might, instead of waiting for the point where it's a crisis and you need maybe somebody to come in twice a day or every day, then essentially that can be quite difficult to share your space as well as the carer. It's not just the cared for who's having to let someone in their home, but it's also you. If you're a carer, you're letting essentially a stranger into your house, and they might be cooking, they might be doing all sorts, or supporting someone in the bathroom, and essentially it feels quite invasive. So starting small and early is a good idea. Having someone come once a week, maybe to take the person you cared for out for a walk, so they get to know each other and they don't start off in your house. And then as you get to know them, maybe you go out for a walk and they stay in your house. And when they stay in your house, you feel like you already know them a bit, and the person that they're caring for and that you're caring for knows them. So you can kind of ease them in. And then as you need more support, you can increase their hours. And ultimately, we have to remember that that person might come from a local care agency. You might make that arrangement, but essentially you might be employing them directly yourself. And in fact, the cared for will be the employer. And that can be a bit of a palaver, being an employer. But sometimes you can employ people who are self-employed, and so they can look after their own national insurance, etc. Although you'd be expected to pay them more. And I have got to say, Michael, it's not easy to find carers at the moment. There's been a lot happening in the last few years that have made carers really difficult to find in certain parts of the country as well. So building up relationships with people in the community, putting your feelers out. And I've even heard of someone putting an advert in a sweet shop to say any carers, and they actually did get one who they like, because it was someone local who had children at school and had a few hours in between and came over and took their loved one out, and it worked very well, and they built a relationship. Eventually you might need more than one person helping. Depends how much care you need at home.
Well, thanks, Trish. I mean, that answers one of the other questions I was going to ask about whether carers would come into the house as well, because it sounds like that they can do and they would do. I've got a more specific question, which is about like the stairs in the property and whether they're safe, and if they're not, what I could maybe do about that.
Yeah, that's really important. Hopefully, at the beginning of all this, you have a relationship of sorts with the person you cared for, your loved one, the cared for's GP. You might share their GP, it might be a separate GP, and it's not always to have a conversation about your cared for, the person you cared for's personal situation with their GP. It would make a big difference if you were their power of attorney in health and welfare. So getting things like that sorted out early are really helpful. So you can become a power of attorney for financial, and sometimes that's all people do. But actually, when someone has a diagnosis that means they're going to progress to the point where they may not have capacity, then it's really important that you also get a power of attorney for health and healthcare, or health and welfare, as we tend to call it, in which case you can have conversations with the GP directly much more easily, and it doesn't break data protection information, because you've been given permission to have that chat. And the GP is essentially the gatekeeper of a lot of services in the community, and one would be to find somebody to come in and check your house out for safety, like the stairs. And that would be an occupational therapist, and they're often referred to as the OT. You might hear that term, but that's an occupational therapist, and they're really excellent as a rule. They tend to sort of work within health, but have a really big foot in the community. So they're really like the bridge, one of the bridges, and there's more than one, but that bridge is really important. The GP will open the doors for health, and the occupational therapist will sort of come out into your life, if you like, with real support that isn't obviously healthcare, but very important around health safety. And so they'll look at risk in your house, and it won't just be the stairs, but it will include those. They will perhaps, if they're doing in-person visits now, which a lot are, going back to that following COVID, is that they'll actually check the person that you're supporting going up and down the stairs to see where they need to hold on, and how their gait is and how they might move. They might look at their bed and how they sit up, how they might need grab rails in the shower. They might also give you tips for how they can remain independent cooking in the kitchen, or having some safety measures put in the kitchen, or just adaptations and appliances. They can be really, really helpful, actually, Michael, in giving you huge amount of information about how safe your house is. And sometimes we think when we put a rail in that we've done a good job. Might have been that we did it ourselves and it seems fine. And actually the occupational therapist comes in and tells you, no, it's the wrong height, the wrong angle, the wrong color. So, really we need a professional at this, and they are excellent at it as well. So they can really give good advice, and a bit like the GP can get us in touch with the speech and language therapist. And whilst that sounds like somebody that only works around supporting someone with communication, whilst with children they always do that, with adults, particularly adults who might be aging with conditions such as dementia, or younger people with dementia too, it's not always commissioned that they'll talk about communication. They may help with that, but what they will help with most definitely is issues around swallowing and eating. So somebody with FTD is packing food, or really struggling, or picking things up off the floor, and I'm sure that'll be talked about later around meal times, but all sorts of problems that you might have. Then a speech and language therapist, sometimes referred to as a SALT, you might see SLT or SALT. They'll often be really excellent at helping you around food and supporting to eat, and maybe mashed food. So you can get in touch with the community mental health team. To be honest, the GP is your gatekeeper here. They're really important, Michael.
Okay, thanks very much, Trish. The only thing I would just like to add that is that if anyone does have any questions that they want to raise with me or interest in, please by all means get in touch, because we're here to do that, to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. Bye, Michael.
Brilliant. Thank you, Trish and Michael, so much for that. And I think a key point, beside all the fantastic and detailed information you've given, is also just the manner of your conversation. I know that was your choice for how to present some of this information, but I think it reflects the wider approach that you both take in your work, and other members of the team, of not wanting to provide generic pre-prepared information, but to really listen and to hear from people about what their current needs and situations are, and to try and, as much as we ever possibly can, provide really practical and specific advice that relates to their particular situation. Just hearing, it's very clear from your conversation that there are many options. We don't want to pretend that this is an easy landscape to navigate, but it's great to know, and I hope it will be really reassuring for people listening, to the fantastically creative and positively minded people like you, who they can speak to directly to try and explore some of these scenarios themselves. So thank you so much, not just for this conversation, but for everything that you do. That's great. Okay, so as Michael, as both Trish and Michael said, but particularly Michael at the end there, please do keep sharing your conversations and your questions and your scenarios that you'd like to raise with people like Trish and Michael on the Q&A panel later on. Thank you for those of you who've already done that. But before we get to that Q&A panel, it's now my pleasure to introduce Claire Waddington, who will be known to many of you. And Claire is going to be talking, really starting us off on a new series for these carer meetings today, about trying to think about specific everyday situations which have the opportunity to be continued and really kind of positive and constructive parts of your everyday life, but which can also present some challenges depending on the type of dementia that you or someone you care for is living with. And I think this reflects a bit like Michael and Trish, is a desire to not just talk about generalizations. We're very conscious that at a meeting like this, there are people affected by at least 7 different forms of dementia who are present and who are interested to find information and advice and support from others. And it would be easy to talk just in generalities. But what we thought might be useful over the next few meetings is to focus on a few aspects of everyday life and to dig a little deeper, and particularly to try and share experiences from amongst different RDS members of things they've tried, things that have been tricky, solutions, or ways of coping that have been found that have meant that rather than feeling like you've got to be beaten or given in to a particular challenge, that you can try and find your way around or try and find a new way of doing things. So today we're going to be focusing particularly on meal times and eating, which is so crucial to us, all not just for sustenance, but for kind of social relationships and a place of gathering. And so we're very grateful to Claire for kicking us off with this and for sharing a little bit about things that people have tried, challenges faced and solutions found around eating and sharing meals together. Claire, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. So we're going to focus on strategies and adaptations to support enjoyment for people living with dementia, but also for you as carers. And we're going to focus specifically on meal times, with the idea that we'll hopefully cover other specific situations in future sessions. Before we get started, I just want to highlight that, as we often say in these meetings, different strategies will work for different people. And this is especially relevant here because there will be people attending who support people with different diagnoses at different stages. And it's also really important to take into account people's individual abilities and preferences as well. So we're going to try to cover a range of mealtime strategies and adaptations that have been shared with us by you, our wonderful Rare Dementia support members, as well as my lovely colleagues. But because we have a limited time available, we're not going to be able to cover everything today. So if you do have strategies or suggestions that we don't get a chance to cover within this presentation, please do pop these in the Q&A and we'll hopefully be able to share some of these at the end of the meeting. So we're going to talk about meal times at home, including meal planning, cooking, during meal times and after meals. We're also going to touch on strategies for meal times when outside of the home as well. So we're going to begin with planning a meal, and what we would really like to do where possible is involve the person living with dementia in choosing what food they would like to eat. If you and they feel comfortable, potentially doing the grocery shopping together in person or selecting groceries together online if you prefer deliveries, or involving the person living with dementia in putting together the shopping list, making sure their food preferences and favourite treats are taken into account. If going through this process as a whole feels too difficult or overwhelming, it might be easier for the person living with dementia to navigate this if they're provided with a couple of options to select between rather than a huge array, as some people might have difficulties with things like decision making. If the person living with dementia has difficulty with communication, it might also help to have visual prompts available to support this choice. So, for example, providing pictures of meals and enabling the person to pick which they would prefer. Someone with dementia might be able to choose meals for a week, for a couple of days, or for one particular day. So it's about working with their particular skills and abilities. And just like all of us, someone with dementia might also change their mind about what they would like to eat when it actually comes to the meal. We've spoken with carers previously who have stocked up the freezer with some of the person's favourite ready meals as a backup, just in case this does occur. And there are also companies that deliver nutritious and, from what we've heard, quite tasty frozen meals on a one-off or a regular basis. And this might be helpful, particularly if cooking is starting to become more difficult for the person living with dementia. So someone living with dementia, depending on their abilities, might find it more difficult to engage with the tasks involved in cooking, potentially due to perceptual difficulties, mobility issues, or difficulties following steps or instructions, like a recipe. Depending on their previous interest and involvement in the cooking process, the person living with dementia might still enjoy providing assistance on what ingredients should be used and how, what cooking method they prefer, and assisting with taste testing if necessary. The person living with dementia might be able to complete the entire cooking process, but might just need prompts in terms of the steps. And these could be verbal prompts from you, a support person, or a smart home device. Or it could be having the recipe broken down into manageable steps that they can refer to visually. So, for example, written down with pictures to help guide the process. Some people might find it helpful to be able to cross off the steps that have already been completed. And you could potentially use a tablet or an iPad to assist with this process. Or you could just laminate a recipe and use a marker that can be wiped off. Alternatively, someone with dementia might find it difficult to cook an entire meal without assistance, but may be very capable of engaging with specific parts of the cooking process. So, for example, chopping or mixing ingredients. Cooking can be a really wonderful activity to engage with together as a person with dementia and a care partner. Even sometimes just being in the kitchen, watching whilst someone potentially talks through what they're doing can be a really great way of engaging in the cooking process. So in terms of preparing for the meal, there are other tasks that the person living with dementia might be able to engage with. For example, setting the table or choosing what music they might want to listen to during the meal. With setting the table, they might be able to set the whole table or a few items. That is absolutely fine. And it's also absolutely okay if the table setting isn't perfect, if the wrong items are used or they're in the wrong place. You can subtly correct things later if you do feel that it's needed. But what we really want to emphasize is supporting the person with dementia to engage in what they can do, with a focus on achievement and, most importantly, enjoyment. So now we come on to the eating part of the meal, and there are a lot of strategies that people use here because there are a lot of different areas that people may need support with or adaptations in terms of meal times. So for people that might have difficulties with memory, decision-making, or initiating activities, prompts might be helpful. So, for example, visual prompts, eating at the same time as the person with dementia so they can follow your lead, gentle reminders to have drinks of water in between bites, and also helping to potentially slow down people's eating, particularly if people might have some difficulties with self-pacing. Verbal prompts, so talking about the meal, what it tastes like, the texture, etc., to make it a really engaging mealtime environment. In terms of the environment, some people might find it helpful to minimize distractions if they're having difficulty focusing on eating. So, for example, eating at the table away from the window and the TV. Other people might find it helpful to have music playing to help create a calming and more enjoyable environment. So the person with dementia might make a bit more mess than they used to when eating because of the way that their symptoms are impacting on their ability to eat. And this can be stressful as the person supporting the person living with dementia in terms of the cleanup that may then be required. So to help minimize this, it might be helpful to have things like wipeable surfaces on and around the table and chairs, and potentially to have larger clothing that you can put on over the clothes that they're wearing that can then easily be washed if any food is dropped. Or we had a lovely example of a person with dementia who was perfectly happy to wear a very stylish apron during meal times. So again, it's about taking people's personal preferences into account in this process. Additionally, someone might find it difficult to sit down and eat and might prefer to eat while walking. If this is the case, it might help to provide food that is easier to clean up if dropped, so potentially finger foods and maybe drier foods as well. So in regards to the meal itself, some people living with dementia might find cutlery difficult to use due to visual or fine motor skills, so might find it easier to use a spoon or adaptive cutlery, or simply to eat with their hands. And they might also find it helpful to use a bowl rather than a plate to help reduce the likelihood of mess. It might also be helpful to have a non-slip surface under the bowl to prevent it from moving around on the table. So if the person living with dementia feels embarrassed or frustrated by these adaptations, it might help to encourage everybody at the table to eat using the same utensils as the person with dementia, so they don't feel like the odd one out. So, for example, we heard from a family who decided that they would all eat salad with their fingers, as that's what the person living with dementia was able and was comfortable with doing. If the person living with dementia takes a long time to eat, then people have found it helpful to serve smaller portions of the meal on small plates and keep the rest of the meal warm so it's still appetizing. Small plates can also be helpful for people who might otherwise eat too much or too quickly, as it helps to stagger the pace and size of the meal as well. If the person living with dementia is having visual or perceptual difficulties, then they might find that plates and cups that contrast with the colour of the table are easier to perceive, as well as food that contrasts with the colour of the plate. They might also find it easier to locate water glasses if they're coloured themselves, or if the water inside a clear glass is coloured. So, for example, adding some squash or some concentrate. So we've spoken about meal times in the home, and now I'm just going to briefly touch on meals outside of the home. So we've had a lot of people feedback that local cafes and restaurants in the community can be really understanding and supportive of people living with dementia, but in order to do so, they might just need some information on how to meet that person's specific needs. potentially by contacting them ahead of time, particularly if there are any concerns about not wanting to speak about those difficulties directly in front of the person living with dementia. If it feels appropriate, it might also be helpful to let people around the person living with dementia know what might be helpful for them when out for meals, what type of support they might need, to increase everyone's understanding and awareness if the person living with dementia doesn't engage in mealtimes in the way that is expected or in the way that they used to. And also to avoid any embarrassment on behalf of yourself and or the person living with dementia, and to help make the social environment more accessible for that person as well. So as well as letting people know about the person's support needs ahead of time, it can also sometimes help to give the person themselves a bit of preparation time ahead of the meal. So for example, a person living with dementia with memory difficulties found it really stressful being asked to remember what they'd ordered at a restaurant when the food was brought out. So they adapted by having the menu from the restaurant ahead of time, writing down what they wanted to order, so they could then refer to this as needed when ordering at the restaurant and when the food was brought out at the restaurant as well. Other things to think about might be time of day, so choosing times or days where the cafe or the restaurant might be less busy. So this just gives the person with dementia a bit more time, potentially a bit less overwhelming sensory stimulation, and helps to reduce the pressure on the person with dementia, but also on you and the others enjoying the meal as well. Something else to think about might be the type of place that you're visiting. So for example, if the person with dementia is having difficulties with portion control, then potentially avoiding restaurants, cafes, and social situations with buffet style or kind of all you can eat style of eating as well. So the last section here, we're just going to focus on some general strategies that might be helpful to support you and the person living with dementia in regards to meal times. So firstly, accessing support. So professionals like occupational therapists who can look at ways of adapting the environment and specialised equipment that might be helpful for meal times. Dietitians to look at any nutritional or dietary concerns. Dentists to look at oral hygiene in terms of eating. Checking sight and hearing to support the person living with dementia to engage in that social mealtime environment in the best way possible for them. Also, just generally speaking with the GP and following up about any health concerns that might be impacting on that person's ability to engage in meal times. Using humour, so where appropriate and without minimising the experience of the person living with dementia. So really taking their lead on this. But in general, sometimes things don't go the way that we plan. And sometimes it's okay to laugh about these things when they happen and to laugh about them together. And sometimes it really helps to be able to do that. Additionally, validating and acknowledging difficulties and frustrations of the person living with dementia, whilst also encouraging and supporting tasks that cater to that person's preferences and their abilities. So using a strength-based approach here, where we look at what the person can do and helping to facilitate that. Also thinking about setting up a mealtime routine to help the person living with dementia navigate this, with the awareness that this routine will change over time as the level of support needed for that person with dementia changes as well. Finally, the focus here is really on achievement and enjoyment rather than perfection. We may need to manage our own expectations in terms of what can be achieved in order to empower and enable the person living with dementia, and also to reduce the pressure that we're putting on ourselves as carers as well. It's okay if a task is not completed perfectly or to the previous standard, as long as the person living with dementia feels safe and engaged in the process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. So much rich food for thought there, and particularly with fantastic examples from so many different members living with different types of dementia about how to keep enjoying mealtimes together, not just for food, but for fun as well, using humour and focusing on achievement and enjoyment, not just keeping things as they were or perfection. So thank you so much. If I could now invite the members of the Q&A panel onto the screen, that would be great. Thank you very much to those of you who have already sent questions, and please do feel free to keep sending questions as we go. If there are any questions we don't get to answer during this time, please don't be offended. It's not that we've chosen one question over another, and we will try to send around some responses to those in the follow-up email, together with all of the slides and other information that's been shared and the recording of today's session. So you won't miss out on anything. A particularly warm welcome to the live version of Claire, and also to Dr. Dexter Penn, who's joining us today. Thank you very much, Dexter. And I will dive, if that's okay, straight into the questions. So one question which I thought we would bring to perhaps to Trish and Claire first, is, I will just read out loud. My husband has non-fluent PPA. As part of the recent assessment to give him his diagnosis, they had changed a face-to-face meeting to a Zoom call. He cannot hold a conversation over a computer, firstly as he cannot speak, and secondly because it's difficult for him to lip read. I therefore answered all of the questions on his behalf with him at my side. When you guys are talking about the needs assessment needing to be without my input, I'm worried they would underestimate his capabilities currently. For example, he's perfectly able to plan a week's shopping based on the recipes he cooks. He's a marvelous cook. He does the washing, etc. What advice do you give on how we would ensure that the assessment is reasonable for someone's condition?
I don't know if you want me to come in on that, or
if that's okay, Trish.
It's okay. I mean, I think it's really a really important issue here. Lots of people, of course, are having remote assessments at the moment under the kind of the cover in many ways, or the sort of blanket of COVID. There's been lots of remote. I mean, we've become remote in some ways as well. Lots of services have had to, because you don't want people to go from house to house, passing on an infection that could make people very sick or worse. So it has been necessary to become as remote as possible, though I think most areas and most services are now beginning to do in-person work again. So I think we need to start maybe pushing for something in person. I think we need to say this needs to be an in-person assessment because my partner cannot access. And if you use the words is unable to access, then that triggers a little bell in the receiver's ear that says, oh, we don't want to be discriminative. Because when someone's refused access, that's a kind of discrimination, really. So usually it helps to say, my person living with dementia, my partner, whoever that might be, cannot access remote assessment. You might have to do this in person. This is a unique scenario. He has some ability and some skills, but he's unable to communicate that verbally because of his specific dementia. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely agree with what Tricia said there. And also just to add that I think when Nikki was talking about somebody doing something unaided in her presentation, she was referring to the tasks that the person does being unaided rather than that assessment itself being unaided. So very, very helpful to have your support during that assessment as long as he was kind of present within that and able to contribute in the way that he was able to as well. But in terms of unaided, that's more about the tasks rather than the assessment itself.
That's great, thank you. And yes, please, all members of the panel, please do feel free to chip in on any of these questions, even if I don't direct it specifically to you, just wave or just unmute and shout in. The next question, so that was a question really about the sort of getting the balance right between the views and the opinions of the person living with and the person caring for and about. The next question is also about balance, but in a slightly different way, about the balance between the physical and the non-physical. So if I just try and read out loud, this is an excellent analysis and categorization of the needs of someone with a rare dementia. I think particularly thinking about Nikki's talk and those categories. However, they mainly focus, these categories in the care assessment, or the needs assessment rather, mainly focus on physical aspects, whether at a personal community level. And this person is asking, what about people's psychological needs? So how do people with rarer dementia think or feel about their condition? We seem to assume that once diagnosed, there's a jump into the physical sphere of needs without giving enough in appropriate time and space for airing their thoughts and feelings about their condition. This is especially the case with those people that remain articulate and open to intellectual stimulation even later into the mid-stage. These other needs would fall naturally into the hands of dementia journey partners without realizing that there could be services available out there for support. The person apologies, sorry for a bit of a long message, certainly no need for apologies. It's a really, really important balance between the physical and the non-physical. Perhaps Claire, I wondered if you might comment on that, but Trish or anyone else, please do feel free to.
Absolutely, and I think it's a brilliant question and really important to address this, that yes, a lot of the assessments do focus on the physical needs of the individual. Absolutely, psychological and emotional needs are hugely important and definitely need to be taken into account as well. And there are a number of services that are available to support these needs. So things like local community groups, they don't have to be dementia specific. In fact, often people prefer it if they're not, so that they can engage in activities that they enjoy. What we often find is that when people get a diagnosis, it's quite common for people to lose that sense of purpose and that sense of meaning that they've had previously. So really important to address that emotional impact of the diagnosis by supporting people to engage in activities that they enjoy that potentially, as we've discussed, may just need to be adapted in some way to be more accessible for them. I also think what's really important to address here is that sometimes people living with a rare dementia might also develop symptoms of anxiety and of depression alongside that. And it's really important that those symptoms are addressed, and kind of speaking to the GP and health professionals about addressing those needs alongside that kind of social support that's available as well. But very important to highlight, so thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Claire. Trish.
Yeah, I just wanted to add everything that Claire said, I agree with as well. But I do want to add, it's true to say that when you're being assessed on need, it's all good and well to say that people's strengths are important and they're, strengths-based assessments. The truth is, what's funded is need. That's the reality. What's funded is need, or what's seen as needing support is need. And if somebody's psychological losses, changes, anxieties, and all the things that can come about because of somebody's diagnosis, if it's affecting what they usually would do, so if they're no longer going out or no longer can maybe go on transport because of anxiety, or don't no longer join in cooking because they've become apathetic, if those things are affecting their engagement, then that becomes a need. But unfortunately, it's quite, it's about translating what it is that they're thinking about or feeling into how it affects actual need. So you kind of translate it into the physical a bit. I hope that's fair enough to say.
Could I just jump in there as well and just add that when we're talking about welfare benefits as well, on the applications for disability-related benefits, so ESA, PIP, or the limited capability for work element of universal credit, again, the psychological element absolutely comes into that. It's not just looking at people's physical needs, but as Trish says, often the way that the psychological impact of a condition does translate into someone's physical ability to carry out one of these activities that are assessed. So it's, if you do make an application for one of these benefits, it's about trying to sort of frame the condition in such a way that it addresses these physical activities as well.
Thank you. And Millie, in the questions, has just kindly shared a question from another member present who is just asking about the fact that, so someone says, I'm actually referring here. So, oh, sorry, it's the original question. I'm sorry. I'm actually referring here to professional support, not necessarily community linked. So, for example, I'd like to advocate for 10 to 12 sessions of psychological support with a professional provider. So I guess on that question, others do please feel free to come in, but I guess that's increasingly why things like access to psychological support after a diagnosis is featured in things like the dementia strategy. And yes, absolutely, that is implemented in very different ways in different places. In some places, a diagnosis of dementia support will bring a whole raft of different types of local and professional support, including for psychological needs. In other places, it doesn't. So there is very certainly inconsistency there, but I think there's a push in that direction. And I suppose it's also another reason why increasingly people are talking about disability rights, or that model of disability rights being applied increasingly for people with dementia, so that we don't just draw on health and kind of medically grounded traditional forms of support, but we're also thinking about other legislation like the Human Rights Act and those sorts, and Disability Act and those sorts of areas, so that we're not just talking about people's physical needs, we're talking about things like your right to a full and effective participation in society, whatever that looks like in an appropriate way for you, about equality of opportunity, and also about accessibility. And by that we also, again, don't just mean physical accessibility, like can I get in that building, but cognitive accessibility as well. How could that activity with a few tweaks and changes be made appropriate for someone with one of these rare forms of dementia? Guys, I don't know if you agree with that comment. Okay, cool. We're going to change track slightly now, if I can get my teeth in, which is to come to Dexter, if it's okay, Dexter, with a different question, which is someone has said, please, could you give us an update on any and all developments around medication? So I guess that's potentially quite a broad question, perhaps thinking about dementia specific treatments, both current and things that are coming along, but perhaps also about other forms of medication that people might use to manage certain symptoms of different degenerative conditions. I hope it's okay to come to you for some of those comments.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. So I'll just summarize just at a high level. So with young onset dementias in general, we have to sort of think slightly differently, as you all will know from your personal lived experiences, that some things are slightly different, and the impact of the symptoms will manifest in and affect different parts of life. So starting off with Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia, the typical type, I'm going to, in terms of the treatments available, we've got 2 at the moment that are currently available, which are not treating the underlying disease process. So it doesn't stop the brain shrinking. But what they do is that the first one, so the anticholinesterase drugs, so donepezil, galantamine, rivastigmine, those types of medications, what they do is they work on the brain chemicals. So you've got one brain cell talking to another brain cell, and they're releasing one chemical here and releasing another chemical here to transmit that message. What the anticholinesterase medications do is that they keep the chemicals available in the space between the cells for a longer period of time, so that gives it a better chance of being transmitted. And the other type of medication, so memantine, this makes the receptors on the receiving end much more receptive to receive that message. So we have a two-way sort of thing, where I sort of like to think about it in terms of making the most of what you've got left to be able to facilitate the control of the symptoms in that case. And this is applicable in posterior cortical atrophy secondary to Alzheimer's disease, as well as logopenic variants. PPA, which they have some overlap with in terms of the underlying disease process. And in terms of what's currently being looked at in terms of clinical trials and drugs that are currently being evaluated for their safety and whether or not they are useful. I know everyone will have heard of some of the anti-inflammatory medications, the monoclonal antibodies, particularly aducanumab, which has had quite a lot of talk about it recently, and it's still controversial for various reasons that I will not get into on this for the sake of time. But effectively, those medications are antibodies against the amyloid protein, and the presence of the amyloid itself, it's toxic to brain cells, and there are different subtypes of amyloid that are present, and the different medications are targeting different parts of that system to try to reduce the inflammation. So you've got some brain cells called microglia that are heavily very important for maintaining the homeostasis in your cell. So the balance, keeping things in balance from an inflammatory point of view. The medications that are targeting those, so that's aducanumab is in that frame. There are also some that are targeting some particular proteins that are in that whole cascade. So there's also another antibody called lecanemab, which is another one. The data on that, people are happier with it, and so we'll see what happens there. Fingers crossed. And we've got other anti-amyloid medications. So a medication called miridesap, which was developed at UCL. It's been sort of like 40 years of work going into that medication. It's targeting a subtype of amyloid called SAP. And we've got that study is currently running, and we're still recruiting on that one. Aducanumab, it's not currently recruiting. So there's some studies that are currently open in that frame that are for people that are mildly affected. So this is the early to moderate group. And so definitely is useful to consider these if you are interested in participating in clinical trials. One caveat to be very clear about is that you are not guaranteed to receive the study medication, because we do something called randomization, where we need to make sure that the things that we observe, that we know what we're actually observing. And so we've got to have some people that are not having the medication compared with some that are, but none of us know who's having the drug or not having the drug. So we have to do it in that way. So just to be really clear there. And we also have some other medications that are directly impacting the levels of the tau protein, which also is increased and causes the brain cells to shrink. There's a medication that it's a gene silencing treatment that you do need to have injections into the spinal fluid. So having a lumbar puncture every month, pretty much. They're trying to reduce it now to less frequently, but that is looking very promising at the moment, and we're just looking at the safety profile as it's now being given to more individuals. And moving on to FTD. So in terms of what we've got available clinically, as you all will know, there aren't any disease-modifying drugs or even medications for symptomatic relief. And there currently is some very exciting work being done now in FTD, behavioral variants, and looking at individuals that have the progranulin mutation. So this is only for people that have a positive genetic test for one of the genes that's implicated in FTD. And the study is currently just going into phase 3. It's about 180 individuals worldwide that have the mutation, and it's a monoclonal antibody. And they're looking at people that are at risk and people that are currently symptomatic in that study. This is one that we currently are running at our center, but again, you must have this gene. So if you've got the gene, you may already know about this. And Finally, just briefly touching on dementia with Lewy bodies, it's a different type of protein, but there's availability of the anticholinesterase inhibitor medications, just like in Alzheimer's disease. Those have been shown to have some benefit in that disease group as well. But those are the main things in terms of the other conditions that are, they've got different proteins. They're mainly observational studies in that space, but they're constantly looking for different targets for medications. But effectively, once you start thinking about things like how do you manage challenging behavior, there are other things that are there, but sort of like out of scope, I think, for this group. But it's just always useful to know that, well, distraction, it's what we advocate for, medication in relation to the last resort for managing challenging behavior. But it is something that unfortunately sometimes we do need to, especially if a person living with the dementia is very, very distressed by the obsessive behaviors or not being able to sleep and that sort of thing. So it sometimes it's necessary. But yeah, I'll leave it there. If there are any other specific questions, happy to chip in.
Thank you, Dexter. That's really, really helpful, really comprehensive, particularly for a varied audience like this. Thank you. So let's try and we'll go push slightly beyond 11:30 if that's okay with people, but I'd like to try and squeeze in 3 more questions. So one short question for Michael and Trish. If we employ a carer, do we have to pay? Or do the local authority pay after a needs assessment? Nice quick one there. Nice simple answer.
Trish, do you want to go for it? So usually when the local authority does a needs assessment, they'll also do what's called a means assessment as well. So that looks at your income, but also your capital. If you have savings or investments over £23,500, I think it is the limit, then you are required to pay the full cost of the care. This is for residential and care at home. Is that right, Trish? Just double. Yep. If you have savings between £14,250 and that £23,500 limit, then you pay. You're treated as having an income from those savings. So I can't remember exactly how much it is actually. Is it £4 for every £250? £1 for every £250? £1 for every £250 of income. So you make some contribution towards it, and it's only if you're below that lower threshold that the local authority will pay for care. But they will also take into consideration any income you have. So that could be income from work or from benefits. Yeah, Trish, I feel like I may have missed something here as well.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I know you've got care that you're providing there for your little one, so it's distracting. I could see the shadow of him joining you, and I'm sure everyone could see. But yes, I mean, it's slightly different figures around the UK. So it's 23,250 in England and Northern Ireland. It's 28,750 in Scotland and 50,000 in Wales. So it is geographically different, and that's what's happening really. That there's, devolution creates a kind of inconsistency. In other words, it's not straightforward. But in England, it's usually, most laws are England and Wales, but in this, it's England and Northern Ireland that share that regulation amount. It's worth saying, though, that if your assets are worth more than that, that's also included. But if somebody of 60 plus lives in the house, or somebody with children or people with disabilities or needs themselves, the house cannot be included and sold. So it's just worth making people feel a bit safe with that. But there is a contribution. I think it's about £1 for every 250 from 14.5 to 23,250 that you contribute. So of course there is going to be some changes we can see that come from what Boris Johnson talked about as an idea, his idea to cap what you're going to pay, particularly for care home costs. mean, this is all showing some change. I will say that idea, I really want everyone to know that idea was a long time ago by Andrew Dilnott, probably about 2014. So it really wasn't this Prime Minister's idea. Essentially, it's been around a long time. It's not as fair as Andrew Dilnott had it. So there are lots of financial concerns here, but it's worth being transparent, open, and be prepared to have a financial assessment. It's really important.
Great, thank you both. One more question for you guys before I come to a final question to Claire, and acknowledging thank you so much for coming. If you've got to disappear promptly at 11:30, we totally understand, but thanks for being here. So Michael and Trish also want to say, someone has written in to say, my sister has behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia and is 68 years old. We've just been through a DWP review for her PIP amount and have been told that because she is of state pension age, there can be no increase in the mobility rate, although her mobility has declined drastically. She currently gets the standard rate for mobility and the enhanced rate for daily living. Is this information correct? So just conscious this may be one that you need to follow up in detail after the meeting. But
I did see this question in the Q&A, and I had a quick search to see if I could get an answer, because the answer is I'm not sure. I know there is a disability benefit for people who are above state pension age called attendance allowance, and there's no mobility component for that whatsoever. But my initial thought was, if you're getting PIP and it is PIP you're receiving, I couldn't find anything in the regulations to say that just because you're above state pension age, you're not entitled to the enhanced rate of the mobility component. But I would need to check that, I'm afraid.
thank you, that's really helpful. And yes, as Michael says, we might not always know the answers immediately because some of these situations are complex, but the team are very keen and very generous and willing to do research around some of these issues where there isn't an immediate and obvious answer. So thank you, Michael. Claire, I'll come to you with the last question, if I may. Someone has written, my husband has behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia, and the problem at mealtimes for us is his lack of awareness of his changed behaviour. He's lost all table manners and eats his food very quickly and then licks the plate clean. I don't feel able to take him out to eat. He tends to request the same foods every day and will not accept alternatives. Any suggestions would be welcomed.
Thank you for the question, and obviously I know we've got a very limited time available, so it might be helpful to arrange kind of a one-to-one call to talk about this further by contacting the direct support team. But just in general, I think it's important to note here that behavioural changes and changes to eating and food preferences are one of the symptoms that people can have when they have a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that these changes are likely due to his condition. So we need to probably make adaptations around him, because it sounds like the problem is not necessarily with his eating behaviour for him, but for the people that are kind of with him when he is eating. In terms of the kind of eating really quickly, as we kind of touched on a little bit in the presentation, sometimes it can be helpful to give smaller portion sizes, so kind of using smaller plates in smaller portions and then bringing these out one by one so that you're helping him to slow down the eating, because there's sometimes a bit of a risk of choking if people are eating really, really quickly. So if you are a bit worried about that, then kind of managing the portions on your end when they come out to him, that might be a helpful way of slowing down if he does just kind of eat very, very quickly. In terms of eating when out and about, again, this might be a situation of finding the right context to do that. So if that's something that you would really like to do or like to try to support him with doing, finding a really quiet cafe at the right time of day, so fitting in with his usual routine for meal times, and letting them know ahead of time that actually he might eat in a little bit of an interesting way that they're not used to, but that's okay, he's absolutely fine, and just to kind of leave him be when he's doing it. So just making people around him aware of that's what's happening. But if he's not distressed by that behaviour, then that's probably the main priority here. So it's probably about managing what we do around him in this context. But yeah, very happy to chat about that further.
Great, thank you, Claire. And as Claire said, thank you for that question and for all the questions you've kindly offered today. We hope we've been able to offer some helpful pointers, and thank you for your questions, because just by raising them, I think you'll be encouraging other people on the call to be able to think that things that they thought they had to deal with themselves, it's okay to ask for help, which after all is the whole point of these sessions. So as we're over time, I won't draw things out too much, but I just wanted to repeat my thanks to the panel and the speakers, those present as well, and as well as those not on the screen at the moment, like Nikki. Great thanks to people like Shama and Millie behind the scenes, who've done all the hard work to prep for meetings like this and bring us all together. And most importantly, to all of you for being here. We again apologise that this is virtual, not face-to-face, but we are very much hoping to have our first physical meeting back together for the PCA support group in April, and hope that will be the start of us being able to offer a more mixed face-to-face and virtual offer. But just to reassure you, we won't be cutting anyone off. We will continue to do things online as well, so that people can access from wherever or in whatever situations you're in. So our heartfelt wishes are with you all. Please do remember, as always, that you can be in touch with the team directly at contact@raredementia-support.org, and to receive one-to-one support there. We don't just offer these group meetings all together, but very much want to support you and your loved ones more individually as well. And we will be, I think, finishing with a short video in a moment, but for now, thank you ever so much, and we'll be in touch in the next week or so with the recording, the slides, and a few other unanswered questions from today's session. But for now, thank you. Hope you have a good rest of the week, and don't get blown away by this storm. All right, bye for now.
Hello, my name is Eva Tate, and I'm the Major Appeals Manager and Manager of the Rare Dementia Support Fund, held by the charity The National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal raises money as the dedicated charity for the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and UCL Queen's Square Institute of Neurology. The National Brain Appeal raises funds for Rare Dementia Support's 2,000 members to help individuals living with rare and early onset forms of dementia, their families, friends, and healthcare professionals. And we also hold several other funds for FTD and dementia research. The funding helps not only the support group meetings in London, but also the regional support groups, admin and support staff, and all other associated expenses, including the new online support groups. When things return to normal, there are travel and accommodation bursaries available to help members attend the meetings. This year, we've raised our fundraising target to 300,000, and this will rise further to 350,000 by 2022 to develop and extend the service in the areas of education, support, and research, with the ultimate aim that everyone affected by a form of rare dementia will have access to specialist information and support, as well as contact with other people with a similar condition. We apply for grants from grant-making trusts, foundations, and livery companies, and have a wonderful group of supporters, some of whom are here today, who fundraise for us in an amazing variety of ways. We would love it if you would like to sign up to our RDS fundraising newsletter to hear more of these stories and receive news of how we can support this community. We have had people do head shaves for us. We have had a gentleman drive across the Mongolian steppe in a VW Polo, and we have lots of people who take part in runs and virtual runs as well. At the end of February, we held a gala dinner called Mission Possible, where we raised 110,000 for the expansion of Rare Dementia Support. And we are delighted to announce that in line with this expansion, the charity is committed to raise up to 7 million to create the world's first centre of excellence for rare dementias. If anyone would like to discuss any fundraising ideas or the new capital appeal, please do feel free to email me or my colleague Alexis, our Senior Fundraising Manager, who will speak about the innovative new ways you can be involved in fundraising for RDS, even during this challenging time. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Alexis Gebby, and I'm the Senior Fundraising Officer at the National Brain Appeal. I just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to all of you who already fundraise for RDS. We really appreciate all of your incredible efforts, especially at this difficult time. My role at the National Brain Appeal is to look after all the amazing people taking on various fundraising activities for us. We have had people challenging themselves to run marathons, cycle long distances, climb mountains, and even take on skydives, all whilst raising money for RDS. We also have wonderful fundraisers out in the community who organise golf days, hold coffee mornings, host choir and carol concerts, and even shave their heads. These people ensure that more people like you can be supported through Rare Dementia Support. If you're interested in becoming one of our fundraising heroes, then please do contact me. I am here to support you with your fundraising, and I'm more than happy to chat about any ideas that you may have. While at the moment it isn't possible to take part in a sporting challenge or hold a big fundraising gathering in your local community, we do have some fundraising ideas, such as taking on a solo virtual run or walk, hosting a quiz for your friends or family online, asking for birthday donations in lieu of going out, or even donating money that you may be saving by not travelling to work or buying your daily coffee. Do get in touch with me if you would like to get involved. In the meantime, take care and we hope to see you soon.